Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that works away at the studio system's balls like a speed bag. I'll be your detective, and today we cap off our retrospective on Christopher Nolan with The Dark Knight Rises. But before we begin the ending, let's go over the case notes. After The Dark Knight became the success that it did, Christopher Nolan was once again hesitant to return to the director's chair, on the grounds that he found it very difficult to name more than a few third films in a trilogy that are actually any good. He insisted to Warner Bros. That he would only return as director if the story was particularly interesting, as he feared he would lose his enthusiasm halfway through the production if he found the film to be unnecessary. So in December of 2008, Christopher Nolan finished a rough story outline for a proposed third film before he had to go off and commit to redrafting and producing Inception, the production of which began in June the next year. In his initial draft, whilst Warner Bros. Were insistent on the Riddler being the main antagonist, their thinking being modelled off the success of the Joker from the previous film, the central antagonist was decided to be Bane, as Nolan was eager to see Batman put through a physical test of wills rather than a psychological one as previously seen in prior films. His outline was also said to have been part inspired by Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, a story of class structure and revolution. It was only until February of 2009, a few short months before Inception started shooting, that Christopher Nolan had felt he had cracked the story for a third Batman movie and committed to returning to the series after Inception. Not long after, David Goyer and Jonathan Nolan came back on board, returning to screenwriting duty, although Goyer left during 2010 as he'd been hired by Warner Bros. To draft a screenplay for a hypothetical Superman reboot based on a pitch he had made to Christopher Nolan, which is why David Goyer is credited with story rather than screenplay. So Chris and John continued drafting the screenplay together, which eventually ended up as a 400-page original draft that drew a majority of its influence from The Dark Knight Returns, the 2003 Nightfall story arc, and No Man's Land. After Inception saw its release in July of 2010, production on The Dark Knight Rises began in December of the same year, with frequent collaborators Wally Pfister, Nathan Crowley and Hans Zimmer returning to their respective production roles. The Dark Knight Rises saw Christopher Nolan continuing to push the IMAX format further, as the movie was shot with over an hour's worth of 70mm footage, hence why the Blu-ray copy of the film jumps between a full-screen aspect ratio and the traditional widescreen standard of 2.35:1. The Dark Knight Rises saw its release on July of 2012, where it received rave critical reception and banked itself in a cumulative $1.08 billion, placing it, as of this video, as the 14th highest grossing movie of all time. So, with the movie firmly contextualised, let's go over the grand finale of The Caped Crusader. In the 8 canonical years since the events of The Dark Knight, Bruce Wayne is retired from his life as Batman and goes reclusive, shying away from any and all public events, whilst Commissioner Gordon is busy going quietly insane, racking himself with guilt after using the falsified story of Harvey Dent's death to enact severe anti-crime measures in Gotham City. All of this comes to a head when Selina Kyle, a highly sophisticated albeit lowly thief played by Anne Hathaway, who's never once referred to as Catwoman sadly, sneaks into Wayne Manor during a charity event held on the grounds and steals a copy of Bruce Wayne's fingerprints to be sold on the black market to an unknown buyer. This presses Bruce to come out of hiding, whilst Batman comes out of retirement upon the arrival in Gotham City of Bane, a masterfully calculated mercenary with ties to the League of Shadows and the aim of usurping Gotham's corrupt hierarchy by rallying together the underclass into a revolution. The turning point comes when Bane and Batman have their first encounter in Gotham's sewers, where Bane cripples Batman and throws him into a prison pit, which serves as a metaphor for Bane's ultimate plan for Gotham's citizens. Like a person turning to seawater to quench their unending thirst, Bane plans to feed the city hope in order to collapse Gotham's infrastructure in on itself, tearing itself apart in the process. Bruce Wayne now finds himself in a position where he must rehabilitate himself and rise once again to stop Bane from destroying his beloved city. The Dark Knight Rises is something of a rare bird in the superhero genre because it is quite definitively an ending. Unlike most other filmmakers who are given a chance to helm a series, Christopher Nolan over the course of 7 years has given Batman a beginning, a middle and an ending. The only real problem conceptually is the very idea of releasing a new film several years after where the last one picked up, one which is often referred to as the greatest superhero movie ever made. So regardless of one's stance on making a third Batman movie in this series, The Dark Knight Rises was probably going to be somewhat disappointing anyway, as there's simply too much event surrounding the previous movie to make up the difference this time. The Dark Knight Rises though makes a game effort of it, attempting to tell the biggest story in the series with the hopes of climaxing with the biggest stakes that Batman has yet been faced with in his entire cinematic life. It's an epic in both time and scale, setting up absolutely massive action set pieces, a multitude of subplots that coincide with each other, packed with a large supporting cast of characters comprised of returning members from the previous movies and new characters reimagined from the comics, and of course the tail end of Bruce Wayne's emotional arc as Batman. But something about it stops everything clicking together in the way that the previous two did. Whilst Batman Begins was a lot more focused on the begins portion of the title, and The Dark Knight had a lot of troubling, albeit debatable philosophical implications, The Dark Knight Rises also finds itself plagued with problems, but this time the problems are a lot more specific to this particular movie in the series. The last time we talked about Batman, we talked about how a majority of the issues in The Dark Knight are largely due to the framing, and whilst a majority of those issues are now cleared up in Rises, the problem shifts to that of structure. Now, contrary to what many screenwriting books will tell you, the concept of a 3-act structure is kind of antiquated and bullshit, on the grounds that there are far more excellent movies that are exceptions to the rule than adhering to the rule itself. So when people talk about story structure, or specifically one that functions in 3 acts, they're generally referring to story order and the placement of scenes scenes within that order. A better way to think of screenplay structure is probably to think in terms of a sequence of important plot points that drive the story forward. A plot point, in this case, being defined as a moment where a character makes a decision that advances the story that they can't then turn back from. For instance, one of the reasons why Green Lantern is such a terrible movie, aside from the everything, is that it literally only has one plot point, which is when during the third act boss fight with Parallax, Hal finally decides to overcome his fears and turn into the hero he always wanted to be, with everything before that just being Hal receiving pep talks about courage from his friends. But getting back on topic, The Dark Knight Rises shares a lot in common with Man of Steel in that its structure is kind of a mess. Allow me to explain. So we get reintroduced to Bruce Wayne at the tail end of his 8-year retirement as Batman, depicted holding a cane that he needs in order to walk in a bid to demonstrate the physical toll his body has taken over the years. Technically though, he really shouldn't need a cane because, come on, it's only been like 8 years, but whatever, we'll play ball for now. So the point when Catwoman and Bane turn up is when the plot officially kicks off, at which point Bruce puts on an electronic knee brace and Batman returns with his knee problem never getting mentioned again. In other words, Rise's best foot forward is to show how world-weary Bruce Wayne is and then immediately take away that problem. Essentially what the screenplay is trying to set up is a story about Bruce Wayne trying to learn how to be Batman again in a somewhat mirrored version of the first film, hence the title. But then right around the 60-minute mark, Bane breaks Batman's spine during the first of two big fistfights and Bruce Wayne's character arc literally starts all over again. And it comes off as incredibly jarring and breaks up what would otherwise have been an interesting story flow. And then for a majority of the middle section of the film, Batman is stuck in a hole trying to learn how to climb himself out while Bane terrorises the authorities back in Gotham, and nothing Bruce learns during his time in the worst hell on earth amounts to anything more than general pablum. And just as things start to get interesting when it starts moving into the no man's land portion of the plot, the narrative suddenly jumps forward by a few months and we feel like we've missed out on potential character building for the supporting players and more interesting ideas before Nolan plunges us headfirst into the climax, which is easily the best section of the movie. So what effectively happens here is whenever Rises finds itself moving towards something interesting, it then whips us in another direction to find something else, all the way up until it decides to give the fans what they want, which is effectively one huge rousing final action scene. The movie certainly is exciting and visceral, but it feels somewhat unearned because the story provides so little to make a meal of. And that's another issue I'd like to raise, which is that Rises often feels surprisingly empty most of the time. There's a lot of stuff that gets made mention of and ideas that get thrown up into the air, such as themes of police overreach, underclass anger, and inequality, but The Dark Knight Rises never finds itself explicitly talking about any of these ideas, and instead a lot of the subjects it raises gets left on the table, as most of this stuff means absolutely nothing by the time we get to the climax. So here's a question. What would you say The Dark Knight Rises is about? Whatever you came up with, you're probably right, because the movie has many different threads going for it, but it doesn't have anything central that ties the proceedings together in any particular way. For instance, we mentioned earlier that Christopher Nolan's initial draft was in part inspired by Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Now that's certainly interesting from a screenwriting standpoint, as The Dark Knight Rises and A Tale of Two Cities have some similarities, among which are that they're both about the disparity between those with power and those without, as well as being broadly about hierarchy, but that notion doesn't really add anything to the series that we don't already know, especially seeing as the entirety of the last two movies were about villains who take umbrage with Gotham's corrupt higher-ups, and how Batman is a different side of the coin in the same conflict. There's a lot of stuff in here about inequality and visual referencing to the then incredibly timely Occupy Wall Street movement that was prevalent, but The Dark Knight Rises doesn't really have anything to say about said things, except perhaps using one of the supporting characters, Selina Kyle, as an audience POV character for a heavy-handed metaphor about underclass proletarian rage not being all it's cracked up to be. The idea of class war, a la A Tale of Two Cities, is thrown in but just not really developed. There's no real voice for the poor masses apart from Blake and Selina Kyle, neither of whom seem to really struggle with or be tempted by Bane's revolution. Blake never wavers in wanting to help Batman restore the status quo and never has, say, a moment where he meets a fellow orphan in Bane's gang and questions his own place. Selina's only dilemma is whether or not she helps or leaves to save her own arse, so her fat cat speech to Bruce Wayne at the charity ball doesn't really carry much emotional weight, as her involvement in Bane's plot is partly unwitting and entirely mercenary. Aside from Blake actually having to consider his position in this conflict, a good opportunity to develop the class war narrative would perhaps have been that trial scene. Bane has a hobo army, apparently motivated by inequality, but they never speak. They're basically all just there for crowd scenes like orcs or zombies. Had they spoken at the trial, say one of them mentioning how their child died because some executive unknowingly sold faulty equipment, or an employee who was driven into poverty because the employer didn't provide health insurance, the scene might have had far more emotional resonance and the revolution as a whole might have made more sense. Hell, one of Blake's former buddies from St. Swithin's might have turned up and denounced the Wayne Industries board for the foundation not giving the orphanage funding anymore. As it stands, it all just looks like the Scarecrow just being crazy again. There's no Madame Defarge character, no embittered accuser to call the rich to account and illustrate the plan and hatred inequality has caused. And while in A Tale of Two Cities the rich are embodied by the vile Marquis St. Evamond, who runs down a peasant child in his coach and then callously flings a gold coin at the body before driving off, The Dark Knight Rises just has Daggett and Stryver, who, while they certainly are uncaring, don't do anything specific to make us see why the poor would want people like them dead. The only thoroughly compelling stuff The Dark Knight Rises has going for it is the stuff concerning the starting premise, as The Dark Knight Rises oddly feels like a rebuttal to the entirety of the previous movie. The movie spends a majority of its running time bringing the Dark Knight's ideas into question and showing that they're flawed. Like in real life, life, the solutions in The Dark Knight might seem acceptable in times of great stress and panic, but this film talks about how things like the solutions and temporary illusion of peace founded on lies and deceit ultimately create worse problems.
We want based on a lie. Another is evil, rising from where we try to bury it.
The lies and manipulation festered beneath the surface of Gotham and turned the entire city insane. The citizens started doling out their own forms of justice, mirroring Batman, to the point of actually setting up their own twisted courtroom to deal with undesirables. Real law and order has broken down, and the fascism of the last film has inevitably led to the nightmare of now. The issue I have with the movie is not that it's pretentious, it's just that all the political gesturing the movie makes feels like wasted breath. Everything I've just mentioned is pure non-specific text, not subtext. There's nothing here that anchors the movie together with any real sense of weight or meaning. And whilst I happily say that The Dark Knight Rises is exciting and engaging all throughout, it's mostly that way cinematically and not narratively, almost as if Nolan delivers some of his best technical direction in the action sequences as a way to overcompensate for an empty screenplay. The problem with the script is largely to do with the abundance of subplots which end up overcomplicating the film almost immediately. Going through them one by one, the main plot is to do with Bane's arrival in Gotham and what that means for its citizens. Bane's plan is to continue the work of Ra's al Ghul from the first film and completely destroy Gotham City. But what's interesting is that much like the Joker last time, Bane's grand sense of destruction is a lot more personal than pyrotechnic, although there are pyrotechnics to be sure. The idea is to lead a peasants' revolt against Gotham's upper class by dethroning the 1% and bringing power and equality to the 99%, at which point the plan becomes about ensuring that the peasants' revolt destroys itself by giving one of Gotham's citizens the detonator to a massive nuclear weapon reworked from a clean energy generator under the city, and waiting for that citizen to pull the trigger, who actually turns out to be Talia al Ghul, making this plan an elaborate ruse to fool the rest of the world watching via the media. In fact, Bane's plan is, in effect, exactly what Ra's was trying to do decades earlier in Bruce's father's time, destroy the city by setting the rich and poor against each other. Thomas Wayne managed to stop this through philanthropy, but Bruce Wayne, by withdrawing from the world, has actually failed, denoted by the St. Swithin's orphanage lacking funds and homeless people being drawn down into the literal sewers to swell Bane's angry tramp army. Putting aside the issue that the Bane character has problems of his own in that he looks and sounds like an angry bollock doing an impression of Sean Connery with a toffee stuck in his dentures, or an angry horse that's just accidentally bitten his own tongue, or a talking Labrador with his lips stuck to a lamppost, or your mum trying to chew for a gag, so I've heard.
A real soul.
Wait, what'd you call me? But putting all that aside, the issue with his plot is that because it goes in and out of the narrative whenever it's most convenient in order to balance with the other subplots, our accumulative time spent with Bane throughout the entire movie is bafflingly short. We open with Bane crashing a government aeroplane before his arrival in Gotham City, but then that gets sidelined for Bruce Wayne dealing with being out of action for a long while, which leads into Selina Kyle showing up and getting Bruce Wayne back into the Batsuit to investigate her, which leads us back to Bane once again around the 40-minute mark where his plot continues. And a little after the first hour, when Bruce gets put out of action again, Bane's plot continues with him isolating the city with the citizens taking over. And just before this idea of self-imposed destruction on behalf of the people of Gotham starts to get the ball rolling, we then cut over to the now disgraced Gotham PD forming an armed resistance and Bruce Wayne returning to the city as Batman. And when we get our big third act twist in the form of everything being the bidding of Talia al Ghul, whose real plan is to actually blow up Gotham City, all the Peasants' Revolt stuff gets completely left on the table. All the Occupy Gotham stuff ends up feeling like a completely empty gesture because Bane and Talia never cared about Gotham citizens in the first place and was just going to blow them up anyway. Especially given that, as I said before, we never spend that much time with Gotham's lower class, or indeed any particular Gotham citizen except John Blake, to make them seem like anything other than totally faceless and expendable. In other words, the structure doesn't really allow for much time for Bane's overall plan to take shape in any real coherent fashion, and as a result, he's probably the least engaging main villain of the Nolan Batman trilogy. So whilst the movie gives itself an incredibly weighty and self-serious tone, the fact that the political nature of the plot drops in and out with any reason or rhyme means that a lot of its allegorical gesturing is giving lip service but is never fully engaged. This moves us on to John Blake, who's probably the one who has the most cohesive character arc in the film. Blake, along with Selina Kyle, is an avatar for the average working man, with the exception that Blake actually works a lot closer to the authorities than Selina does. His initial frustrations that he's perpetually shunned for trying to be a good person eventually lead him down a road where he's working with Jim Gordon and Batman side by side, and at the end of the film finds himself on a path to becoming the next Batman. Or perhaps the first Robin, because this time they've decided to get all cute with the continuity. So once again we find another subplot to do with the circumstantial nature of a lowly person finding themselves in a position to take the law into their own hands. In the first film that person was Bruce Wayne, in the second it was Harvey Dent, and in this movie we have John Blake. The difference maker is that whilst Harvey Dent backlashed against the system he initially helped support and paid for it with his life, Blake eventually becomes aware of what Gotham City does to people like Harvey Dent and then takes the law into his own hands. At the end, when the public think Batman has died and they celebrate his life with a huge statue, Blake then takes up the mantle of the Batman, setting up a new future for Gotham City with a new protector. The issue with this though is kind of where we find ourselves revisiting the fascism angle from the last movie. The problem we had last time was that the morally ambiguous framing made the political nature of The Dark Knight accidentally skewed to one side. With The Dark Knight Rises, the movie somewhat trips over its own feet on addressing this this issue. Throughout the series, especially the last film, it's made a point of that Batman represents the same corrupt status quo that allows itself to produce people like Bane, and that Gotham City probably doesn't need Batman in the long term, but then we're asked to root for Batman as he restores the corrupt status quo and enshrines the destructive influence of the Batman into perpetual myth. And that sense of perpetual myth is where we find ourselves with John Blake. The problem is, the very idea of there being a new Batman detracts from the sense of catharsis and moving on which Bruce Wayne's happy ending provides. I mean, here he is choosing to be a new Batman instead of a new Gordon, yet Gordon seems to be fine with this. Now, a city police force is not an inherently flawed idea. Gotham needed Batman back in Batman Begins because Gordon was literally the only true non-corrupt policeman in the city at the time.
In a town this big, who's there to write to anyway?
If good skilled officers like Blake are coming up now, he'll want them to stay. From his point of view, that of a police commissioner, Gotham doesn't need vigilantes so much as it needs policemen who give a shit. This scene basically ignores a major character's motivations in the effort to explain away the required elements of another, the clear sign of a tacked-on plot element. Perhaps the Nolans and Goya felt like they had to get Robin in somewhere, even though he doesn't, as a character, remotely fit the tone of this trilogy. So they bulked out a minor role to provide in movie continuity with a kind of Robin come Batman 2. Kind of like how they got the Batmobile into Arkham Knight, even though you've been happily swinging around the city like Tarzan for a couple of games and never needed to leave a carbon footprint before, making it seem like a surplus to requirements and only present out of a grudging sense of obligation. Of course, this inadvertently gives the audience the strange impression that they're setting up the character for another film, even though this was intended to be a definite end. That his real name is Robin scene could easily be one of the post-credit teaser sequences from one of the MCU films back when they were setting up the Avengers. You half expect Sam Jackson to suddenly walk in and make a crack about tights. He probably would have worked much better as a character by remaining a cop, suggesting that the efforts of people like Wayne and Gordon have inspired good, ordinary people to do their part in building a healthy, safe Gotham. A kid from an orphanage, no less, could have fallen into the life of crime like many of his peers, but instead... well, you get the picture. Given Blake's role as the ordinary person with the opportunity to take the law into his own hands, choosing not to do so, especially for such underwhelming reasons as the rules being too much trouble for a special snowflake like him, could have represented Gotham moving on from both the lawlessness of Falcone, Joker and Bane and the extra-legal fascistic order of the Batman, the time of crisis requiring a special leader Dent described having ended, rather than an infinite crisis requiring a Batman in perpetuity. Making Blake Robin is a mistake, but that doesn't mean Blake is without purpose as a character. There are two sides to Blake, the cop and the orphan. Trouble is, all the cop stuff he does could really have been done by Gordon, a character we already know, had he gotten away only slightly injured. It makes it seem like his hospitalisation was written in to justify Blake getting more screen time, so his orphanage exposition feels more natural to us. Given we know Gordon much better because of the previous two films, it seems as if we could have gleaned more about the inner workings of Blake by having him teamed up with a healthy Gordon in a kind of charming buddy movie dynamic. Or maybe that's just me. The Blake as orphan scenes justify his character a lot more. He gives Bruce the be angry at everything forever speech, which, along with his visit to Gordon at the hospital, convinces him to get up, put the suit on again, and get the crap beaten out of him by Bane. Yeah, nicely done. He also introduces the St. Swithin's Orphanarium, which forms part of our picture of the growing rich-poor divide in Gotham, the other end being represented by the one-dimensional Bullingdon types Daggett and Stryver, sneering embodiments of privilege who eat mink coats and bathe in the tears of endangered baby seals. On the other hand, Blake's big anger in his speech is characterisation by telling at its worst. Blake talks about being angry in his bones, his superior keeps calling him a hothead for spurious reasons, but we don't actually see him do anything hot-headed, unless competence is suddenly hot-headedness now. We don't see him act in a way that reflects the personality we're told he has, beyond the same surprising willingness to cooperate with Batman Gordon did. This all makes him feel slightly flat. We've been told about him, but we've never seen him, so when he talks about the rules being too restrictive and leaves the police as part of his inexplicable mock sequel baiting, it makes little sense as we've only seen him argue with one jackass superior everyone else probably hated too. It just seems a bit forced, like they're trying to wrap things together in a nice neat little bow Revenge of the Sith style. So Blake feels a bit tacked on, but is at least somewhat functional. On the other hand, there's Selina Kyle and Talia. Selina's story revolves around her being a cat burglar living under lowly circumstances with her accomplice, Jen, played by Juno Temple, trying to dig her way out of a hole by stealing a copy of Bruce Wayne's fingerprints at the behest of Daggett, who turns out to be working underneath Bane as a smaller piece in a larger machine. Her ultimate goal is to seek out a rumoured clean slate, a MacGuffin, a piece of technology that will wipe her name from every police database in the world. It's her main driving motivation in the plot, and nothing will get in her way in order to clean her name. In a sense, she ultimately finds herself as yet another cog in Bane's revolution, as she inadvertently ends up being on his side, which leads her to serve up Batman to Bane in order to take him out of the equation. Over time, she and Batman, as well as Bruce Wayne, end up warming to each other, which is the point where she makes the jump over to the ostensible good team, as well as coming to the realisation that Bane's revolution is ultimately a destructive force that she didn't mean to have any part of. Selina is given a choice towards the third act between leaving Gotham City with the clean slate that Batman gave her, or join forces with Batman to stop Bane in the final conflict. In the end, she decides to stick around and try and bring down the mess that she inadvertently helped initiate. Catwoman is easily one of the best characters in the movie, made so primarily because of Anne Hathaway's performance, performance. What's so amazing is the greatness of Catwoman's character is almost entirely Hathaway's own doing. Functionally, on a screenplay level, Catwoman is a cipher used primarily to move bits of the plot around and chop when necessary to keep things moving forward, as well as being an avatar character for what it's like to be a part of a social inequality movement from the inside and how it's supposedly not all it's cracked up to be. For the longest time, given Nolan has a fairly asexual relationship with the idea of romance over the years, it looks as if it would be a genuine surprise if she turns out not having to end up being a love interest, as is precisely what happened the last time, and then she is. And given that Nolan's movies tend not to be exactly romantic, with the possible exception of Cobb and Mel and Inception, Selina's endpoint as a character finishing up this way does feel somewhat forced and contrived. The same thing goes for Talia al Ghul, although this is something the Batman fans of the comics have been anticipating since Batman Begins, but that's actually part of the problem. See, if you know much about Batman canon, you'll know that when Ra's al Ghul and the League of Shadows turn up in something, you can almost be certain Talia will turn up as well, and that Talia and Batman's most famous moments together are their on and off psychosexual romance, in a kind of darker mirror imaging of Batman's relationship with Catwoman, except that Talia and Batman did actually end up having a child together by the name of Damian, who ends up being the new Robin when Dick Grayson took up the mantle of Batman for a bit. You guys should read more stuff by Grant Morrison, honestly. Anyway, the point is, if you wanted an appropriate romantic subplot with any other character, Talia would be it. But the problem is, because Talia is so inextricably tied to the League of Shadows, it's not really much of a surprise to Batman fans that this seemingly innocuous woman by the name of Miranda Tate actually turns out to be Talia. What I mean is, it's cool that she finally shows up, but if you're a fan and we know that the League of Shadows exists in this version of Batman, then you'll be able to guess who Miranda actually is the moment she shows up. And on the other hand, I can only imagine that for non-fans, the idea of the trustworthy Miranda Tate actually turning out to be the real main villain would primarily just feel like a third act twist purely for its own sake. Do you see what I'm getting at here with all these different threads? They've all got their own ideas and themes, and probably would have made great Batman movies of their own right, but the problem is that they don't sit comfortably together and form a stable central core. This is in part because of the rather disparate choice of stories to base the screenplay on. Thus far, across Nolan's 3 Batman movies, each film has had its basis in a mix of previously existing Batman stories that serves as the spine of each film. Batman Begins is based on The Man Who Falls Year 1 and The Long Halloween, which makes sense because that story was about Batman during his early days, and each story supports that. The Dark Knight also borrows influence from The Long Halloween because that story in part retold Two-Face's origin, and also borrows from The Killing Joke for a definitive take on who the Joker is, as well as borrowing elements from the main plot. The Dark Knight Rises is supposedly based on The Dark Knight Returns, Nightfall and No Man's Land, all three of which are seen as examples of Batman's greatest stories, but put them together into a singular plot is no small task. The Dark Knight Returns is a grand and operatic story about Batman coming out of a long retirement after the death of Jason Todd at the hands of the Joker, and fights back against the now skyrocketing crime rate during a particularly intense heatwave, and eventually finds himself fighting Superman, who's now working for the government under President Ronald Reagan in a world where masked vigilantes are now outlawed. Nightfall was a hero replacement story about Batman being temporarily put out of action by Bane and being replaced for a time by Azrael, a murdering psychopath who wears a stupidly elaborate and pouch-laden version of the Batsuit as an in-joke, with the point of being a reminder to fans why Batman doesn't kill people. And No Man's Land is about Gotham City turning into a secluded island after a massive earthquake, and Batman and co have to protect the civilians in the middle of a big supervillain turf war, which is incidentally an idea that Arkham City nicked. And all these ideas fit together how exactly? Which is why we end up with a story where Batman returns only to have his spine broken, Gotham becomes an island run by civilian revolt, Batman returns again to beat up the main bad guy and stops a huge bomb from going off before disappearing again forever. I struggle to think about which part of the story The Dark Knight explicitly rises in, unless we're talking about Brock Blaster over there.
Hashtag let's rock and roll.
So overall, The Dark Knight Rises is something of a mess that had quite a bit of potential. It's in part why I'm so disappointed and why I don't want to be so negative. That's the main thing that eats me, that this series, with its aesthetic preferences towards smarter theming and socio-political gesturing, as well as delivering one of the more fascinating interpretations of the Batman character onto screens, ends its series on such a sour note in terms of the quality. So easily The Dark Knight Rises is almost certainly the weakest of the 3 Nolan Batman movies, but that's kind of by default of the others being far superior rather than this movie being incompetent or outright bad, which it isn't. The cast is excellent, the performances are rock solid, the big set pieces are spectacular, albeit certain individual fight sequences are rather dramatically unengaging, and the editing is watertight. The problem is that a review that focuses almost entirely on the negative is bound to happen because there's so little else to be made mention of. In other words, The Dark Knight Rises finds its footing as yet another technically proficient and exciting action blockbuster that somewhat blows it in the story department, much like many other similar movies released that summer, which annoys me to no end because this is coming from a filmmaker who, intentionally or not, reinvented the Hollywood action movie in his own image. So sadly, The Dark Knight Rises just feels like another slice of the pie that we've already eaten before. It doesn't suck, nor does it feel particularly brilliant. To me, it just feels horrendously average, which coming from a fan of Christopher Nolan should sound like heresy. And on that note, I call it case closed on The Dark Knight Rises. But there are still 2 questions that remain though, the first of which is why did Christopher Nolan's style become so popular for a time? Well, to answer that, allow me to introduce you to Mr. Howard Moskowitz, courtesy of Malcolm Gladwell. Dr. Howard Moskowitz is an American market researcher and psychophysicist, best known for revamping Prego spaghetti sauce back in the 1980s, as well as his pioneering research into horizontal segmentation. In the 1980s, Moskowitz was asked by Campbell's Soup to help create the perfect spaghetti sauce. Campbell's had Prego, which was struggling financially up against Ragu at the time, and they wanted the help of a preeminent market researcher to help them nail down that one winning formula that would beat the competition. Prego was objectively seen as the superior sauce, with even those who had taste tested it thinking it was better, but ragu was ultimately still winning. Campbell's soup basically needed the equivalent of a killer app, but Moskowitz, however, didn't think that way. Before this, he had worked with Pepsi to try and find the correct amount of aspartame to put in Diet Pepsi. He concluded that there is no perfect amount. There is no perfect Pepsi, he said, only perfect Pepsis. And this is what he told Campbell's soup, that there is no perfect spaghetti sauce, only perfect spaghetti sauces. Moskowitz never attempted to find the perfect spaghetti sauce. What he did do instead was have Campbell's kitchen staff create 45 different kinds of spaghetti sauce. He then presented them to the public and had them taste test them, asking them to rate what they personally felt about them afterwards out of 100. After collecting a mountain of data, he not looked for the most popular sauce, he looked for the most popular sauces and tried to find the most common elements that people liked, and found that there are roughly 3 kinds of spaghetti sauce customer: those that like it plain, those that like it spicy, and those that like it extra chunky. That third option was something of a revelation because neither Prego or ragu had a line of extra chunky sauce. Nobody had thought to provide an extra chunky sauce, and it's not as if the public were asking for something because they'd never thought about such a thing. Think about that for a second. An entire third of the customer base for spaghetti sauce wanted something that literally nobody was providing. Campbell's then came out of a line of extra chunky spaghetti sauce, and the results were almost instant, and they ended up making roughly around 600 million in the first year. And if you go to the supermarket today and you look for a jar of spaghetti sauce, you're likely to find a variety of different types of spaghetti sauces, because there is no perfect spaghetti sauce, only perfect spaghetti sauces. This is a show where we talk about movies, so why are we talking about spaghetti sauce? Well, Moskowitz's research in the 1980s largely revolved around food, but his findings can be applied to the big budget movie industry surprisingly easily. So for the sake of analogy, let's cast Warner Brothers as Prego and Marvel/Disney as ragu. Now, many have argued that DC's output should be better movies because on the whole they appear to have better filmmakers and more interesting ideas that they're willing to play around with on a screenplay level, and yet Marvel's MCU still has a huge unshakable fanbase and their trailers don't seem to make anyone wince at the prospects of their movie's arrival. Why is that?
We have a Hulk.
Well, there's that, but part of it I feel is that Marvel and Disney seem to be way more interested in horizontal segmentation than Warner Brothers are. I think that if it's possible to assemble a winning baseball team with a mathematical formula, then you could probably do the exact same for a movie. It's just that currently Hollywood doesn't have a model for such a movie, so it instead opts to use stupid models as a proxy. In other words, if a movie about dogs fails at the box office, then the audience clearly doesn't get dogs, rather than you made a fuck-awful movie that just so happened to be about dogs. Christopher Nolan, and by extension his Batman movies, is a perfect example of Hollywood getting it completely wrong in terms of what's popular. Nolan basically found a niche in the market for something that hadn't been made before, the notion of the realistic superhero movie, and Hollywood interprets this as, well, that's clearly what people want, so let's just make loads more of that, because of course oversaturating your market is a really fucking clever idea. Marvel's output is almost always the clear winner due to the variety of different stuff it has to offer. Simply put, whatever you want to watch in a movie during the summer, Marvel's got you covered. If you want old school no nonsense action, then you've got Captain America. If you want robots, you've got Iron Man. If you want monsters, you've got the Hulk. If you want high fantasy, you've got Thor, and the Avengers are essentially the melting pot blockbuster that everyone in the audience can get a kick out of. Where DC seem to be going wrong with their construction of the Justice League is that they're treating all the characters in the exact same way. I mean, think about it, how much more interested are you in Superman knowing that Batman is pretty much the same? A gifted yet troubled hero figure battling his own demons as well as external forces. This is assuming Wonder Woman will be the same, seeing as this series of movies is under the same creative group who made Man of Steel. It's why it's always interesting to revisit director Zack Snyder's quote about making Superman cool again, because basically all that seems to mean is repackaging an already familiar character for a demographic it already knows how to sell to, rather than doing what Marvel was doing, which is basically making their movies however they damn well please and telling its audience why you should care about these characters. That's why something as awesome, new and fun like Guardians of the Galaxy is seen as a huge financial risk, because they're perceived as throwing a stone that hasn't been tried into unfamiliar waters, and why Warner Brothers is playing it safe by continuing the so-called grim and gritty route because Warners are acting like pre-chunky Prego. This way of thinking isn't exclusive to superheroes either. I remember how a few short years ago Twilight was dominating the box office and every other studio had their own big budgeted paranormal romance cash spinner based on a series of teen-oriented books in production. Then along comes The Hunger Games, which wasn't paranormal romance but certainly was based on a young adult series of books, and makes upwards of 150 million on its opening weekend, so now everything teen-oriented is now a dystopic future sci-fi thing where the characters are up against some kind of parental figure, which is meant to be analogous to whatever teenagers like to rebel against these days, rather than actually doing what The Hunger Games did, which was present a new thing for an established audience bracket. The point I'm trying to get at is that Christopher Nolan's style and aesthetic choices as a writer-director becoming as popular and as ubiquitous as they have been is just a symptom of a larger issue in terms of Hollywood's absolutely stupid attitude towards what they think is guaranteed money, convincing themselves that directly copy-pasting the success of one thing onto another will provide the same revenue. So on this issue, I'll say to those at Warner Brothers, or indeed any other studio that has a license for a big superhero property with the aim of creating their own rival continuity, if you're going to copy anything about Marvel and Disney's approach to creating the Avengers, copy their methods, copy the self-assured confidence and material, not the fucking business strategy. Variety is the spice of life, my friends. Embrace horizontal segmentation, because there is no perfect spaghetti sauce. So that's that. But before we go, we've still got one final question, the question that we've been pondering over the entirety of this retrospective. What is a Christopher Nolan movie? A Christopher Nolan movie is one that largely favours introspection over external character problems. He frequently puts his characters in a position where they find difficulty balancing the professionalism of their duty and their feelings as a person. Christopher Nolan has been described as Hegelian, which ostensibly means that he deals in the uncertain, preferring to plunge the audience into a giant three-layer trifle of ambiguity and probable lies, hoping to find some precious chocolatey nugget of universal truth at the centre. But more broadly, he's something of a postmodernist. With his characters caught between morality, temporality, identity and entropy, he more often than not tells transgressive stories about people caught in boxes, and asks us whether or not their actions used to escape are the best actions to take. A Christopher Nolan movie is one that believes the audience is smarter than they're normally accustomed to being given credit for. By using film noir tropes, existentialism, Franz Kafka, M.C. Escher, Sigmund Freud, Alfred Hitchcock and thriller-style premises, his movies create new ways to question the audience's perception of truth, logic and storytelling, drawing deliberate attention to the inherently manipulative nature of the medium itself, and merging the subjectivity of the audience's perspective with the subjectivity of his protagonists. Technique-wise, he favours a relatively hands-off approach to camera work whilst maintaining a hands-on approach to writing and editing. Fundamentally, he's an ideas man. But whilst his movies are calculated and thoughtful, I wouldn't describe any of his stories as being emotionally chilly. Whilst he certainly is more of a conceptual thinker, there are still great moments of humanism prevalent in all of his work. Or something like that. Just so we've all got a better definition than grim and gritty, yeah? And on that note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, and that was Christopher Nolan.